Live stream. I've got it. Okay. Okay. I want to share my screen. So I'm sharing the screen and we're getting going. All right. So this is kind of interesting. The last few verses in chapter 3, we've actually already read them, okay? Is Nevuchadnezzar, the king, is sending this letter to all of the different nations according to their languages, etc., all the people that he rules over, all of the land. And he says, you should have great peace to you. He's etc. And he talks about these signs and wonders and how much he has to be grateful to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And he goes on at somewhat length. And we were like, does this have to do with the story we just read? There is, if you take a look, if you have a Sefer, or you can see it here on the screen, I hope, you see that pay? That pay means that there's a big open space between the end of verse 30 and the beginning of verse 31. So if you don't pay attention to that, and you do pay attention to the chapter divisions, you assume that the thing that he's writing about is the story that just took place. There was, he put these people into the fiery furnace and they survived and they walked around and the whole, and he's acknowledging, he was in the wrong and, you can be able to worship God. We actually heard that from him. And you think, maybe this is what this letter is about. But in fact, when you see that there's this big open break, it says, no, that story's finished already. And we're starting a new story here. And you should know, you may already know this. I don't know whether everybody who's going to listen to this does know it. The chapter divisions in Tanakh are not part of the Jewish Masorah. They're not part of our tradition. They were put in place by Daniel Bomberg and somebody else, both of whom were Christian printers. And they were, one of the things that they did when they first had the printing press was they were looking for, who would buy books. And the vast majority of Jews know how to read. And the vast majority of non-Jews at that time did not know how to read because books in those days were very expensive because everything had to be copied by hand. And the printing press made a huge revolution in terms of world literacy. But so these printers, when they were looking for a population of people for customers, they decided that they would print things for the Jewish communities, for the Jewish consumption, because Jews knew how to read, and so they would appreciate having a book they knew how to read. But the printers themselves, sort of determined where they were going to put the chapter marks, and they decided to number the verses and things like that. So the chapter divisions is not part of the Jewish Masorah. It's either part of a Christian Masorah or even possibly not even that it's so much a Christian Masorah. It's just that it was convenient to divide up the books into chapters. All right, fine. Why they decided that these 3 verses belong to chapter 3 and didn't belong to chapter 4 is not at all clear to me. Because in our Masorah, in fact, what we're going to see is that these last three verses of what we call chapter 3 just flow right into chapter 4. And the whole thing is the text of this letter that Nevuchadnezzar sent. All right. One of the Mamarim that I was reading about said, it's actually very unusual. We have very few places in Tanakh where the person that we are hearing from directly, that we're quoting directly, is a non-Jew. We have a sort of the report of a speech that was given by Rav Shaka in Sefer Malachim. We have Bilam's prophecies / blessings / curses in Sefer Bamidbar. And in Sefer Ezra maybe more than Nehemiah, we have quotations from documents of the time. But here is very unusual because we have this letter is not, most of the rest of Sefer Daniel seems to be Daniel's own diary / autobiography. And this one, although Daniel will appear in chapter 4, in this one, it's Nebuchadnezzar speaking about Daniel. Everywhere else, it's Ana Daniel. Daniel, did this happened, that happened. The first chapter, which was setting the scene, it was a little bit in third person, but really very much of it is in first person, in Daniel's own voice. And here he brings to us, and it's almost a chapter worth of Tanakh, he brings to us this letter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote. So that's also a question, like, why didn't he just tell us about it? Why did he give us the story through Nebuchadnezzar's eyes rather than through his own eyes? We have to sort of infer what was Daniel's response through how Nebuchadnezzar saw Daniel behaving, which is, anyway, it's just, to me, it's sort of both in a literary sense, but also like, I suppose I can see, right? If you're writing, you're keeping, you have a journal or something. And so people have journal, like you might slip in, oh, here was a copy of this letter, and you put that letter into your journal. Okay. So or people used to make, I say used to, people still do. People make scrapbooks. And so if you have you may put in like the invitation to the wedding, and you may put in, a letter that you got of congratulations, or a thank you note, or, pictures, and you may track your child's life through pictures and little things that they did, and then you write stuff yourself, and it's a combination of things. So, so in that sense, maybe, but it's still a question, all right? So at any rate, because I don't want to, we've done these 3 verses before, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but Malbim, if I remember correctly. So Malbim, I like going over Malbim's questions just to make sure that we're not missing anything, because he asks really good questions. And he says on these last 3 verses, which are the introduction to this letter, and he asks us the question, like, what did he want to do with this letter? And what was the purpose of his writing it? And why did he say, where's the language? Shafar. Here it is. Shafar kadamai lahachavaya. It's a good thing for me to tell over the story. Okay. It's something that's important for me to tell. So why did he say that? Right? About what and why? And what are these signs and wonders to Maya? Wow, he was like so surprised that God did this with me. What was this thing? And what were the signs, how mighty they were, and the wonders, how strong they were. Like he just doubled over the language again. He said it first, and then he said it again in the very next line of his letter. Now, okay, kings get to write however they want to, number one. Number two, sometimes repeating things emphasizes stuff. So maybe we have answers. This is written by Nevuchadnezzar. This isn't even written by Daniel, right? So he can maybe, but, and there's also, Malbim's next question was, what is the reason, whoops, I just lost the questions. The questions are up here. But on the third verse, he asks the question also, why did he repeat, sort of double this language of Malchut? His Malchut, meaning God's Malchut, is a Malchut Olam. Now, I don't know, Malchut Olam. I don't think, that doesn't sound so weird in Hebrew. I don't understand. I guess I don't particularly understand his question. But the other thing he's saying is, but first he talked about Malchut, and then he talked about Shilton, which is the rule. So there's God's kingdom or dominion, and there's God's rule. And in one case, he calls it, right, Alam, like Leolam Va'ed, forever and ever. And in the other case, he calls it Dor V'Dor. And so Malbim has questions about that. And we're going to ask a bunch of questions. We're going to go through here the rest of the letter. What was it that he felt he needed to share with everybody? And then next week, some of the outstanding questions that, or questions that you come up with, or questions that I come up with, or questions that, that we get from some of our mefarshim. So then next week we'll do some of the makshava kind of stuff. Like that's sort of the pattern that we're doing, is like, what's the story? What bothers us about the story? What are the underpinnings of the story? And so it takes us a few weeks to do the whole thing. But anyway, as I said, we've seen these verses before. And so now so the first part of it was Nevuchadnezzar was sending greetings to the entire empire. And so now starts talking about, and so now he's going to tell over this story. Now comes the body of what it is that he's telling. And he starts off in a sort of interesting way. He says, Ana Nevuchadnezzar shlei hivet beveti ranan behechli. I, Nevuchadnezzar, shlei is like the word shalva. He was serene. He was at peace in his own house. And ranan behechali, and he was vigorous in his palace. Okay, so everything was going great for him. Malbim's question is why did he put this business of being at peace in his house at the top of the list? What does that have to do with the story that he's trying to tell us? Okay. And he goes on. What does he say? He says, Chelem chazet v'yedachalinani. Wow. So first he said, look, I was totally at peace, everything was great. And then all of a sudden, I had a dream that I saw, and it scared me. And the thoughts while I was in my bed, while I was lying down, right? And the things that I saw in my head, they totally discombobulated me. Okay, so that in itself could be an answer to why did he start off by saying, oh, I was just fine, I was totally at peace. Like, we know that often dreams at night reflect what we went through during the daytime. But I was at peace and everything was great. And then I had this dream that scared me. Now, we still don't know, by the way. Maybe he's still talking about the dream that we saw in chapter 2. So it's going to take us a while before we realize, no, this is a new dream. This is something else. Because so far, we had the intro, we had the story where Nevuchadnezzar had this dream and threatened to kill everybody, and Daniel decides he needs to do something about it, and he and his friends daven to Kadosh Baruch Hu, that Kadosh Baruch Hu should send them the solution, and they resolve it, and Nebuchadnezzar is pleased with that, and then Nebuchadnezzar decides to build. Right? We heard the Musar that sometimes a great deal of wealth is not good for people. He had way too much gold, didn't know what to do with it, so he built that huge statue, tried to get everybody to bow down to it. We've heard this story, and now we have this letter. So maybe the letter is referring back to one of the first 2 parts of the story, because now we're going to hear it from Nebuchadnezzar's side as opposed to hearing it from Daniel's side. Maybe, but we don't know yet. Okay, but maybe the answer to the question about why does he start off about the shalva, about the serenity and the peace in his house, is because he's saying this dream that scared me is not a result of something that happened during the day. It's not the result of something that was bothering me, that I was thinking about, etc. Remember, that was one of the things that we heard Daniel explain to Nebuchadnezzar about that first dream, is that it was a reasonable thing for a king to wonder what was going to come after him. What was going to be his legacy, what was going to come afterwards, because a king is not just a private individual. He needs to think about he has to think about setting policy and setting something up that will last beyond his day. And so Daniel said, so that's why God sent you an answer to those things that you were concerned about. That was what that first dream was about. This one, I'm tipping my hand. This one is a different dream. We're going to see that in a little bit, but we haven't gotten to it yet. If you're just reading at this point, you might think it's still on that first dream because it's a dream that scared him and discombobulated him. Okay, fine. And he goes on and he says, this is Nebuchadnezzar. This whole thing is Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, Umini sim te'em lahan ala kadamai l'chol chakimei bavel. Di fashar chalme Yehodeunani. And so he sent out a call kriya. He sent out a call that to bring before me, he says, right? Because he's speaking in first person. Bring before me, and this. All of the wise men of Bavel, that they should be able to interpret the dream and make it known to him. So, Malbim has some questions for us. What's this business of Umini Sim Ta'am? Right? And from me, there's this reason. Like he says, Hayal Olomar, he should have said just that he sent to call all the Khartoumim of Bavel, all of the, here we have the word Chachmei, wise people. He called, and if you remember back in chapter 2, it was the Khartoumim and like 3-4 different kinds, and the Kasdim and the this and all the different types of soothsayers and whatever. And this time, it's just the general word Chachime. And if you also remember, Daniel had been put in charge of all of the Chachime, all of the various different kinds of Chachamim that there were in Bavel. And it's like Daniel was put in charge of the, call it the information agencies. There are all these different agencies. There's this kind of agency and that kind. And Daniel's in charge of all of them. So it sounds like the call should have for sure gone out to Daniel. Right? And, like, why is the language here different from the language that we had back in chapter 2? But so that's one of Malbim's questions. And then he has another question, which is, but let's hear the verse and then we'll understand his question a little better, right? So he says, B'dain alin chartume ashvaya, kasdae v'gazar raya, v'chelma amar ana kadamehon ufishrei la mahodi'inli. So then the Khartoumim and the Ashfaya and the Kasdaim, right? All this, now we have that whole list of the 4 different kinds of soothsayers and fortune tellers and whatever. They all came. They all entered before him. And I told them the dream. Oh, so now we know it's not the same dream as in chapter 2. Because in chapter 2, he couldn't tell them the dream. He couldn't remember it. All he knew was that he woke up mizazeh. He woke up and he was disturbed. But this time, he remembered it well enough to be able to tell it over to them. Okay, so it's not the same dream. This is where we finally figure out for sure it's not a recall of chapter 2, just from a different point of view. And he says, I told them the dream, and they weren't able to make the solution known to me. Now, in chapter 2, when they couldn't make it known to him, and they couldn't tell him what the dream was, and they couldn't tell him the solution, he threatened to kill every last one of them. Right? And this time, there's no threat to them. It's just like, oh, well, you can't help, and you can't help, and you can't help. And so then we come to verse 5, which is Va'ad achrein al kadamai dania. Kadamai dania. Okay, so, and then until at the end, afterwards, al is the word for to enter, to come in. Daniel came in before me. Okay, fine. Who is Daniel? Dishmei Belshazzar, Kashum Elahi, which means who. So it acknowledges that his name is Daniel. That's his own name, right? But his name, his public name, is Belshazzar, like the name of my God. Okay. Fine. So I believe that our Mefarshim all talked about the fact that the names that Daniel and Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah were given were all names that were connected to the Avodah Zorah of the Bavlim, of the Kasdim. But we didn't actually see a proof of that in the text. We just sort of took it on faith from our Mefarshim, but our Mefarshim weren't making it up, and it is in the text because it's right here in the text, okay? And then it says further, this is Nevuchadnezzar speaking about Daniel, right? V'di ruach Elohim kadishin be, and that the Now, it's interesting. Different Mefarshim will read this differently. We know that we use a plural to refer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, although HaKadosh Baruch Hu was one, right? Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hashem is one. But the word Elokim is a plural word. But it doesn't mean that he is more than one God. It means that he has all of the powers that could possibly be had. That's what that name refers to, as having power. And it's all of the power. And so it's in the plural, but it's referring to the one God. So the question is, when Nebuchadnezzar said at that time, at the beginning, okay, to Daniel, or about Daniel, that Daniel is somebody who has the Ruach Elokim Kadishim in him. Does that mean that he has the spirit of the one holy God within him, right? He has Ruach HaKodesh. Or does it mean, the way other translations will read it, that Nebuchadnezzar thought that he, communed with various spirits. And so it's with the holy, the spirits on the side of good as opposed to the spirits on the side of bad. And he's seeing it as gods with a little g, as it were. Okay, so that's also a question. All right, v'chelma kademohi amrit. So finally, Daniel comes in, and he has this other name we've given him, this name that's based on our Avodah Zarah, and we know he has the good spirits speak within him, and I told over my dream before him. So let's go back and make sure we didn't miss any of Malbim's questions. Here are the questions here. So he asked the question, right? Why did he not command to kill all of the wise people who failed to tell him what it was? And why did Daniel come in last? The previous dream that he had that perturbed him, it ended up being Daniel that solved the problem for him. So why do you go to somebody that doesn't work when you've got somebody on staff that does work? It seems like if you know that you've got somebody available to you who can do it, why do you try with somebody else? And that's Malbim's question. Seems like a good question to me. Okay. All right. And right. And right. So those were the questions basically that Malbim had come up with also. So, okay, feels pretty good about that. And so now Nebuchadnezzar is going on with his story. And he says, Belshazzar, Rav Chartumaya di ana yidet di ruach halakim kadishin ba. And again, right, so this Belshazzar, this time he's not even being identified as Daniel, who is the head of all of the soothsayers, or astrologers or whatever, right? Because he, like I said, we saw he was appointed at the end of chapter 2. The end of chapter 2, he was appointed to be in charge of everybody. So, right? And that I know, says Nebuchadnezzar, that I know that, so Nebuchadnezzar is reporting in his letter that he's sending to the world what happened. He says, I turned to Belshazzar, who finally came in, and I said to him, Belshazzar, Rav Chartumaya, that's his title, that I know that the spirit of holy gods is in you. And no secret is prevented from you. So I'm going to tell you about the visions of my dream that I saw, and you should tell me its solution. Okay. So now Nevuchadnezzar is about to describe the dream. Until now, we haven't actually heard the dream. All that we heard was everything was going along swimmingly. Nonetheless, he had a dream that frightened him, discombobulated him. He called people in to try to give him an answer to it. By the way, that's a good Jewish practice. Okay, if you have a dream that either that repeats, or you have a dream that you wake up feeling disturbed, okay, like in the first dream where we heard titpa'im, that your heart is beating strongly or whatever, you have some kind of a dream like that, it's a good practice to find somebody to tell over your dream to them and to ask them to give you a good interpretation of the dream. Because we believe that dreams go according to their often go according to their interpretations. In other words, somebody who interprets it in a good way, so then that's the way that it will actually play out in the world. And somebody who interprets it in a bad way, then that's the way it'll play out in the world. And so you want to go to somebody who can take whatever was bothering you, whatever was in your dream, and can interpret it for you in a good way, so that you can, so that it will come out to be good. And anybody who's interested in more about the issue of dreams and stuff, it shows up in Gemara Brachot, in a lot of Agadata there, and I can point you to some shiurim that were given that are online that go through a whole lot of that. But this is Nevuchadnezzar's dream. Okay. And he's turning to Daniel to get what hopefully from his perspective is going to be a good solution, not just a solution and an explanation, but like a way that it's going to make sense for him. And he goes on and he says, he says to Daniel, the chezve reshi al mishkavi. So I saw my head was on my pillow. I was lying down. And these were the visions that were in my head. Chazeh havet v'alu ilan b'go ara v'hume sagi. So what did I see? I saw a tree. Okay. And the tree was in the middle of the world, and it was very tall. Okay. Ravi Lano Takif, it was a great and mighty tree. Rume, such a wonderful parak to be reading right before Tu B'Shvat, don't you think? Okay. Varume Yimte Lishmaya, and its height reached up to the heavens. Vachazote L'sof Kol Ara, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. You could see it from that end and that end. You could see Lahavdil, but like what he tried to do with that pestle that he built in Bikat Dura, okay, in the Valley of Dura, he tried to build this thing, right, that was 60 amma tall, so that it could be seen from everywhere within the Bikah and all the surrounding, lands. But this tree was even like much mightier than that. It reached all the way to the heavens, and it was visible everywhere. Okay, fine. So I I have a question. Is there some kind of parallel between this tree that he's seeing and that statue that he tried to build? Is it either a mita connected mita thing, or is it, referring it like to me, it's like something which is tall, which tries to reach the world, and okay, we're well past the time of Migdal Bavel, but after all, this is Bavel, right? And Migdal Bavel, they tried to reach this language of Yimte Lishmaya is exactly the language that Onkelos uses to describe Migdal Bavel when they were trying to build this tower that would reach to the sky. Okay, that's why when I got to this, I'm like, oh, I recognize that language. It's not quite exactly the same. This Aramaic is an older version of Aramaic than Onkelos by a good number of centuries, but it's close enough that I can follow the language, and it's like, oh, I remember that phrase. I've heard that before, and so you start to build some recognition in. All right, fine. So let's keep going. Okay. And he says, Afye Shapir V'in Beisagi. Okay, it had beautiful branches, a beautiful like canopy, and a great deal of fruit. The inbeit, it's similar to a Hebrew word for the budding and the blossoming and the fruit stuff. Okay. And umazon lekolave, and it provided food for everybody, all the different animals and whoever that was living in and on this tree. Okay. Techotohi tatlel chevat bara, and underneath it. So this is the word, and again, I recognize it because it's a word that gets used about the schach, is that you have to have more tzeil, you have to have more shade than sun. So there's a tzadi tet for people who are into the Aramaic, just throwing in a little bit of that here and there. So there's that tzadi tet switch. This is the word tzeil, right? It created shade. Chevat bara, the wild animals, uvanfoki, Yeduran, Sipare Shmaya, and in its branches there dwelled the birds of the heavens, Umine, Yitzin, Kol Bisra, and everybody, the whole world basically was able to be nourished from this amazing tree. Okay, now, why is he scared? Because this part of the dream sounds very much like that shalva, that pleasant serenity that he was talking about from the beginning, right? So it's a little like we haven't gotten to the scary part yet. And he's going on at length with a fair amount of detail about how pleasant it was at the beginning of the dream. All right. Malcolm's going to have questions again now on the next several verses, but let's hear the verses first and then see what questions he adds for us. It says, Chazeh hevet bechezve reshi al mishkavi. He goes on again and he says, this vision that the things that I saw in my head while I was, on my bed. Ba'alu ir v'kadish min shmaya nachit. And all of a sudden now the word ir, you might think means city, because that's what it means in Hebrew. But, and ir actually, or ira, I think it is, also can mean a type of donkey, of a wild donkey. It shows up in Yaakov's blessing to Yehuda. But in Aramaic, and if you sing any of like the Arizal songs or something like that, we talk about Irim Kadishin. The Irim Kadishin are not holy cities. The Irim Kadishin are holy angels. Okay. The English translation that I saw was interesting, and it translates it as the Watchers with a capital W. And I'm assuming that they get that from the idea of like la'arer, to look at, to be aware of. But okay. So it says, so anyway, so there's this this angel, the Kaddish, and this holy thing that came down from the heavens. Min Shmaya Nachi. That already, I mean, I'm not personally used to seeing angels. I mean, I see angels within the people around me, Baruch Hashem, but I'm not used to seeing, like flaming angels or something that I would recognize as being totally non-human angel coming down. But that might already get me a little shocked, right? And the next verse is Karei B'chayil. V'kein amor gedul Ailana v'katzatzu anfohi ataru afye ubadru inbe tnud chevta min tachtohi v'tzeparaya min anfohi. Oh my goodness! And he called out to this, to the with strength, etc. And he said, "Cut down the tree." Is like legadea is to truncate it, cut down the tree and chop off its branches and disperse its right, all of the other the little branches, like everything, and disperse its fruit and exile the animals out from underneath it, the animals that had been living there, and the birds from its branches. So there was this big, beautiful tree that was sustaining everything, and all of a sudden, this angel comes down and decrees upon it that it's to be cut down. And that alone, I guess, would be kind of like, why? It was doing such a good job. It was being so healthy and wholesome, and like, why? So I see where that would get a little scary. And then it says, Baram ikar shashoi ba'ara shvuku uve'eser divarzel unchash b'ditata divra uvetal shma Yitztaba v'im chevta chalake ba'asev ara. Baram is sort of like, however, but something like that. The root, its roots, and the stump of it should stay in the ground. All right, and it should be bound up, as sores, like the Hebrew word. Okay, it should be bound up with barzel, and nachash is nachoshet, it's not a snake. Okay, and it's going to be with now, this is an interesting word, okay, but your tafshin switch may give it away. But bedita is, means with the desha, right? And it's just going to be at this tree that had been so amazing and so sustaining to all different kinds of beings, is now going to be at one with the desha, with the herbage, the full, the ground cover. And it'll be drenched, it'll be drowned in the dew of the heavens. And its portion is going to be together with the animals. And in the grasses of the earth. There's a weird switch that goes on here. Okay. Up until here, it's very much been talking about a tree. Okay. But trees don't move around. What does it mean that its portion is going to be together with the animals of the field? And it gets weirder, okay, in the next couple of verses. Because all of a sudden it says, Livave min anasha yashana. His heart, its heart will be changed from being human. Ulavav cheva yichihivle, and an animal heart will be given to him. Now you have to understand that for sure in our writings, we refer to the heart as the seat of knowing. Sometimes we talk about like a thinking heart and a feeling mind. We actually know that there's something up here, that thing we call a brain, that may have to do with it. But we talk about the heart as really being the seat of how and where we know. And so it's saying that the human understanding is going to be taken away. Now, what tree has human understanding? Okay, so there's been a switch all of a sudden, but it's in a dream. So dreams do weird things, all right? And it's going to have only animal understanding, all right? And Shiva Idanin Yachlefun Elohi, and there will be 7 periods of time, 7 seasons, 7 years, some things are going to pass over it. All right, so I need to figure out where a reasonable stopping place is. We started a little late, but I don't want to go too long and over how long we've been recording and stuff. All right. So the questions on these verses that we read, and maybe I get to read one more to go along with his question. So what questions it is what's the difference between an ear and a kaddish? Okay. I said one is a malach, but I kind of didn't treat it as though it was 2 different things. And Malbim's saying, no, pay attention to the language. What's the difference between these 2? And also, what's this business later on about where there's a doubling in the language? This is something Malbim always asks questions like, why don't you just say it once? Why are you saying it twice? And he assumes that if you're saying it twice, that there's a reason behind it, and he gives reasons. So he says, why is the gezerat of the earrings, that's the verse we didn't get to yet, doubled, okay, both in Pitkama, the word, and in Ma'amar Kedishin. Okay, in other words, the verse that we didn't get to doubles up language there. It says it in 2 different ways. Oops, I have to go back to where the questions are before I go down to look at that verse. And then he says, and what does this have to do with a tree? Like that they're going to bind it in iron and copper or bronze. Like, really, the tree is going to go somewhere? What does that mean? All right. And what does it mean that it's going to eat grass with the animals? Right. That was so that question I also asked. I mean, so I can feel a little good, right? Before I looked at Mom's questions, I also asked that question, like, it was a tree we were talking about. What is its portion is to eat with the animals? Like, what is, that seems a little strange. So what's going on? So presumably when we hear Daniel's answer, we're going to understand. When we hear his solution to the dream, we'll understand it. But it's Malbim's helping us focus in on what are these questions, what kinds of things are weird about this dream, what details of it are maybe shtus, and which details of it actually have a message for Nevuchadnezzar or for us. Okay. And also this question that we asked him, what's this business about the heart, what the heart of a tree is going to change from being human to being animal? Like, what does that have anything to do with a tree? Okay, we can talk about the heartwood of a tree, but that's the heartwood of a tree isn't human either. So what does this have to do with a tree? And of course, that's what Daniel is going to have to explain. Okay. So the one verse that I didn't read that Malbim had questions about also, and then I think I'm going to call it quits here, is Bigzerat Irin Hit Gama Umamar Kadishin Sheelta. So that's what the Malbim asked about, was why does it say both of these? According to the Zera of these Irin, which are certain kind of angel, is the word. That's where the word is. And the Ma'amar, in the speech of the Kaddishi, remember there was an Ir and a Kaddish, is the She'elta, is what's being asked, what's being demanded. Ad divra di yindeun chaya di shalit ila b'malchut anasha ulaman di yitzpe yitnana ushfal anashim yakim Allah. That this is about how until this tree, person, animal, whatever, okay, comes to the point of understanding that there is a supernal ruler, right? Melech Elyon, Shalit Elyon, okay, who appoints over human kingdoms, and whoever he wants to give the power to, he can. Whether it's a lowly person, he can raise up and make that person high. Okay? Which is, so that's what has to be done. And then you can understand why Nevuchadnezzar is disturbed, at the very least. I would say that we are probably an hour into this, so I'm going to call it quits here. Next week, I may try to answer some of them, but I didn't get quite as far in the dream itself as I wanted to. I wanted to leave you. I'd hoped to finish off the dream. So before I go back over to the Ramat Valley and the deeper meanings that we've also been enjoying learning with Sefer Daniel, I'm going to probably continue in the dream and then go back and deal with the deeper questions later on. Do you have any questions from the part that we've heard so far? No. Okay. So in that case, I'm going to stop the share, stop the